She was sitting at a candlelit table in one of Beirut's finest hotels, drinking wine, eating dinner, wearing a green scarf draped over a chic sports jacket. The man across from her was chatting casually. Anyone watching would have seen two people enjoying a quiet Tuesday evening in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Nobody was watching. And that was the point. Her name is still classified. The Mossad has never confirmed it publicly. She told parts of her story 4 decades later under strict conditions, her real identity still protected, photographs of her taken after 1973 still sealed in intelligence files. The world has called her Yael. That is her operational code name, not her name. What is documented is this. At some point during that dinner, the man across from her, an Israeli intelligence contact she knew as Eviatar, asked a question about her apartment, about the view, about the neighbors. She told him they were home, all 3 of them. She did not know that outside, in the dark water off the Lebanese coast, Israeli missile boats had been sitting for hours, waiting for exactly those words. She did not know that the moment she answered, a force of armed commandos, some of them dressed as women, began moving toward the shore. She finished her dinner. She went home. By the time she woke up the next morning, 3 of the most powerful Palestinian leaders alive were dead in their apartments, 200 meters from where she slept. Something for you before we go further, since you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. Our limited edition ebook covers the same targeting infrastructure this operation was built on. Months of quiet surveillance, agents embedded inside the cities their targets called home, the cases that never made it into any public file. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy. Then stay with us, this story is just getting started. This is not a story about a single night. It is a story about 7 months of preparation, a government that collapsed, and an operation that succeeded so completely that it quietly set in motion consequences nobody had planned for. Here is what almost nobody outside of Israel understood about the Munich massacre in the weeks after it happened. The failure was not just West German. It was architectural. September 5, 1972, the Summer Olympics in Munich. 8 Black September operatives scaled the fence of the Olympic Village in the early hours of the morning and took 11 Israeli athletes and coaches hostage. The operation had been months in the planning. The timing was not accidental. The most watched sporting event on the planet was in its 2nd week, with cameras from every major broadcast network already in place. The world watched what happened next in real time. West German authorities had no trained counter-terrorism unit, no established protocol, no rehearsed response for a hostage situation at a major international event. What they had were snipers without radio communication, a plan built on assumptions that collapsed within minutes, and a confrontation at a military airfield that turned into a massacre. All 11 hostages died. 5 of the 8 attackers were killed. 3 were captured and would later be released. The Olympic Games resumed 2 days later. In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Golda Meir convened a secret cabinet committee. What she was trying to solve was not just the question of what to do about Munich. She was trying to solve a pattern. The Avivim school bus attack. The Lod airport shooting. Now this. The argument that each attack was isolated, unlikely to repeat, best answered through diplomatic channels. She had heard it multiple times. Each time, another attack had followed. What the committee approved was Operation Wrath of God. Wrath of God was not a military campaign, it was a Mossad-directed program of targeted killings. Its mandate was specific: locate and eliminate the planners, coordinators, and operational architects of Munich. Not in a war zone, wherever they were, however long it took. The Mossad began moving through Europe over the autumn and winter of 1972. Targets were tracked through Rome, Paris, Athens, Cyprus. Several men connected to Munich were killed in operations that were quiet, precisely executed, and attracted limited public attention. The campaign was functioning. But the 3 men at the top of the target list had not moved. They were not hiding in safe houses. They were not rotating between cities under false identities. They were living openly, in a fashionable residential neighborhood in West Beirut, inside a city that operated, as far as anyone could tell, entirely beyond Israel's reach. Beirut in 1973 was not what it would become. It was a Mediterranean city at what its residents believed was its peak. Restaurants and galleries and ski resorts within an hour's drive. A financial center drawing money from across the Arab world. A place where European expatriates, Palestinian officials, Lebanese businessmen, and international journalists all moved through the same streets and sat in the same cafes. It was the city that called itself the Paris of the Middle East, and the description was not entirely vanity. The three men lived in two 7-story residential apartment buildings on Verdun Street, a well-kept road in the Verdun district of West Beirut. Their neighbors were British families, Italian families, Lebanese professionals. The buildings were unremarkable. The men moved in and out of them like anyone else. Mohammed Youssef al-Nashjar, known by his nom de guerre Abu Youssef, was Yasser Arafat's unofficial deputy. He ran Fatah's internal intelligence organization. He had previously commanded Fatah's operations throughout Lebanon. He was considered the third-ranking figure in the entire Fatah leadership structure. Kamal Adwan directed Fatah's political department and coordinated operations against Israeli targets across the Lebanese border. Kamal Nasser was the public voice of the PLO, its spokesman, a member of the executive committee, and by many accounts a genuine intellectual. His apartment was said to contain a private library that was the envy of anyone who saw it. All three were believed to have had roles in the planning and authorization of Munich. And all three believed, with reasonable justification, that Beirut made them safe. The Lebanese government could not move against them without triggering a crisis with Palestinian organizations that had armed presence across the country. Israel had never conducted an operation of this kind inside Lebanon's capital. The geography, the politics, and the international visibility of the city all functioned as protection. That assumption was about to be tested. In January 1973, a woman arrived in Beirut. She carried a cover identity the Mossad had constructed with care. She presented herself as an American screenwriter researching a television project, a documentary about Lady Hester Stanhope, the 19th-century British eccentric who had lived in the region. It was a cover story that made sense in Beirut, where the international creative class moved freely, asked questions about local history, and walked neighborhoods at odd hours with notebooks and cameras. She rented an apartment on Verdun Street, directly across from the two buildings where the three men lived. Her Mossad codename was Nielsen. She had been described internally as an exceptionally talented and cool-headed operative who used her quiet charisma and her appearance as instruments of her work. She had almost failed her recruitment screening, unable to find her car after her first meeting with a Mossad examiner, a detail that suggested poor spatial awareness or extreme anxiety, neither of which the organization typically accepted. Her handlers had looked past it. Over the weeks and months that followed, Nielsen watched. She documented the routines of the men across the street, the times they left, the times they returned, the patterns of the guards posted outside the buildings. She photographed potential landing areas on the Lebanese coast using a concealed camera. She mapped entry and exit points as carefully as she could from her position. She was living 200 meters from three men who, if they ever correctly identified her, would understand exactly what her presence meant. There is no record of how she managed that. No account of whether she felt anything about the specificity of what she was doing, the months of accumulated detail, the fact that her intelligence was not going to end in an arrest or a trial or a deportation. She sent her reports back. She kept watching. By early spring of 1973, Mossad had what it needed to plan an operation, but there was a problem the intelligence files could not solve. The three men had to be in their apartments at the same time. Not two of them. All three. A partial hit, one man killed, two alerted, would end any possibility of a follow-up. It would expose Israeli operational methods. It would give the PLO everything it needed to redesign its security posture in ways that might make Beirut permanently inaccessible. The operation required a real-time confirmation. Someone who could look across a street and say, "Tonight, now, they are home." Nielsen was that person. And as of the evening of April 9, 1973, the force that would act on her confirmation had already left Israeli waters without telling her. Phase 2. The problem of getting in Ehud Barak was 31 years old. That detail matters more than it might seem. The man tasked with planning and commanding the ground element of the most audacious Israeli operation since the founding of the state was not a senior officer with decades behind him. He was a lieutenant colonel who had risen fast, led Sayeret Matkal through multiple operations, and built a reputation for methodical precision that his superiors trusted. But he was 31, leading a mission into the heart of a foreign capital, with a plan that had no margin for the kind of improvisation that might rescue a more conventional operation if something went wrong early. He had the intelligence from Nielsen. He had the building layouts. He had approval from the highest levels of the Israeli government. What he did not have was any precedent for what he was being asked to do. No Israeli operation had ever placed armed commandos inside Beirut. The city was not a border zone where incursions, however dangerous, were at least within the operational vocabulary of the forces involved. It was a functioning capital with international visibility, a Lebanese internal security force, an army, and a civilian population that included journalists, diplomats, and foreign nationals whose presence in any crossfire would produce consequences that extended well beyond the operation itself. The first problem Barak had to solve was not tactical. It was theatrical. A group of armed men moving through the Verdun district of West Beirut after midnight would be noticed. Not necessarily by the PLO. By anyone. A Lebanese gendarme walking his beat. A neighbor arriving home late. A cafe owner locking up for the night. Any of these encounters, handled badly, could alert the targets before the teams were in position, and the operation had a sequencing requirement that made any early alert catastrophic. All 3 apartment doors had to be breached at the same moment. The first sound of a forced entry would travel across the street and up the stairwells of the second building within seconds. If any team was not at their door when the first breach began, the operation was over. The solution came from David Elazar, the Israeli chief of staff. Disguise the force as tourists. Some of the commandos, including Barak himself, would dress as women. The logic was precise and a little brutal in its simplicity. A group that included women read differently to anyone who happened to see them on the street. A man in evening clothes walking with a woman toward a residential building at midnight was ordinary. A group of men moving quietly in the same direction was not. Barak prepared for this with the same discipline he brought to everything else. He wore a wig. He dressed as a brunette woman. He rehearsed it. The rest of the force trained on empty apartment buildings in northern Tel Aviv selected for their architectural similarity to the Verdun targets. They drilled the door breach using explosive fuses designed to take the hinges without warning. They ran the apartment clearance until it was reflexive. What they could not train for was what they had not been told. Nielsen's surveillance had documented the exterior guard rotation outside the 2 buildings with considerable precision. She had mapped their patterns over months, the positions, the shift changes, the gaps. The intelligence product was thorough. What it could not capture, because no surveillance operation conducted from an apartment window can capture it, was the interior of the buildings beyond the lobby level. What the commandos would encounter once the doors were open and they were inside, how the guards were positioned, whether the targets were alone, who else was in those apartments, they did not fully know. The operation was also being planned against a clock that no one had publicly acknowledged. 5 days before launch, a separate Mossad team in Paris had killed Basil Kubaisi, a ranking FLEP member. Kubaisi's death carried an informational cost. Every killing in the Wrath of God campaign was a signal that the campaign was active. At some point, the men on Verdun Street would respond to the pattern of deaths around them by increasing their security, reinforcing the guards, or moving entirely. The window for reaching them in this configuration was not open indefinitely. The question nobody wanted to answer directly was how long it had already been open. On the evening of April 9, the Israeli missile boats left Haifa Naval Base. They carried the assault force and a fleet of Zodiac inflatable speedboats. When the boats reached a point offshore from the Lebanese coast, the Zodiacs were lowered into the water with the Commandos already aboard. They ran the motors until they were close enough to be heard from shore. Then they killed the engines and rowed the rest of the way in the dark. Mossad agents were waiting on the beach. 3 luxury American cars, rented the previous day. The agents loaded the teams and drove toward Verdun. In a restaurant across the city, Nielsen was having dinner. She did not know any of this was happening. The operations planners had made a specific decision. She would be informed only that the force was offshore and waiting for her confirmation. She would not be told when they had launched. She would not be told the exact state of the force when she sat down with Eviatar. The decision was protective. If anything compromised her in the hours before that dinner, she could not inadvertently reveal operational details she did not have. What this meant in practice was that when she told Eviatar the men were home, she was giving what she understood to be a preliminary clearance, a check-in to confirm the operational pictures still matched what Mossad had planned against. She was not aware that her answer was the trigger. The force was already in motion before she spoke. It could not easily reverse. The Zodiacs had landed. The cars were moving. The teams were minutes from the target buildings. Eviatar's call back to the operational command confirming her answer was not the beginning of the action. It was the final authorization for an action that was already materially underway. If she had said they were not home, or that something had changed, the situation would have become an abort problem that had no clean solution. A force of armed Israeli commandos in 3 rented cars, in disguise, in Beirut, with no target. She said they were home. The operation's entire architecture rested on one assumption that nobody had tested under operational conditions, that 3 senior PLO leaders, living in residential apartments in a mixed civilian building, would be encountered the way the planning described them, as targets inside a security architecture. Guards on the exterior. Weapons accessible. Men who understood they were at risk and lived accordingly. The intelligence supported this framing. The surveillance had documented the guards. The building access was controlled. These were men with enemies, and they knew it. What the intelligence had not reframed was what these men looked like from the inside of their own lives. They were not in bunkers. They were in apartments. Abu Yusef's wife was home. That single fact, which was knowable, which was consistent with how men in his position generally lived when they believed themselves to be safe, had not been treated as a variable that altered the operation's moral or practical calculus during the planning phase. It had been filtered out. The framing of the operation as a strike against a security architecture had quietly removed the human context of the target's domestic lives from the planning conversation. This is not unusual in how such operations are planned. The abstraction is partly functional. Operatives who are rehearsing a door breach cannot simultaneously rehearse the emotional texture of what they will find when the door opens. The abstraction is also partly protective. If you are asking men to go through an apartment door in a foreign city and kill the people on the other side, the planning language cannot afford to be fully descriptive of everything that implies. But the gap between the planning abstraction and the operational reality was real, and it would not stay theoretical once the teams were inside. There was a second problem that was also becoming visible in the hours before launch, and it was structural in a way that no amount of additional rehearsal could have addressed. The Lebanese internal security forces, the gendarmes, patrolled Verdun regularly. Their presence was documented. The planning had accounted for a response force arriving at some point after the breach, which is why Barak's exterior backup team was positioned to hold the perimeter while the assault teams were inside. What the planning had estimated was a response time, how long until gendarmes arrived, how long the exterior element would need to hold before the teams extracted. That estimate was a calculation, not a certainty. It was built on the assumption that the Lebanese security response would behave within a predictable range. If the response was faster than expected, or heavier, the extraction window would compress in ways the planning had not modeled, and there was something else. On the route between Verdun Street and the extraction beach, the planning had identified a clean corridor. The cars would move through it, reach the shore, and the Zodiacs would take the force back to the missile boats. What the planning had not placed on that route was a Lebanese army armored personnel carrier. Whether one would be there on the night of April 9 was not something any surveillance could tell them. An armored vehicle on the extraction route was not an obstacle that the force's cover identities, tourists, a brunette woman, rented American cars, could navigate around if it stopped them. The teams were at the doors. They did not know what was waiting on the way out. The cars stopped short. Barak's team was a block from the target buildings when one of the Mossad drivers held up. Not a roadblock. Not a checkpoint. A Lebanese couple walking slowly along the pavement, arm in arm, close enough to the building entrance that the teams could not dismount and move toward the doors without passing within feet of them. It was past midnight in a residential neighborhood. The couple had no reason to be suspicious and every reason to notice a group of people climbing out of 3 cars at once. The teams waited. This is the moment the planning does not account for and cannot account for the ordinary obstruction. Not a guard, not a patrol, not an intelligence failure. 2 people who had stayed out late and happened to be walking home past the exact address that an Israeli commando force needed to access in the next few minutes without being observed by anyone. The drivers kept the engines running. Barak watched from the front vehicle. The couple reached the far end of the block and turned a corner. The teams dismounted. What happened in the next few minutes unfolded along 2 parallel lines that the planning had tried to synchronize precisely, and that reality immediately began pulling apart. On one side of Verdun Street, a Sayeret Matkal team moved toward the building that housed Abu Yusuf. On the other side, 2 teams converged on the building where Adwan and Nasser both lived, on different floors. The exterior guards were at their positions. The teams had silenced weapons. The guards were neutralized before they could respond, before sound could move up the stairwells or across the street. That part worked. What came next did not follow the sequence the rehearsal had produced. The team moving toward Abu Yusuf's floor encountered a guard inside the building, not at the exterior position Nielsen's surveillance had documented, but in the stairwell, 1 flight below the target floor. This was not where the planning had placed him. Either the rotation had changed that evening, or there was a guard position inside the building that the surveillance window across the street could not have seen. The team dealt with him, but the seconds it cost mattered. The teams on the other side of the street were already at their doors. Simultaneous breach was the non-negotiable requirement. It was the axis the entire operation turned on. And 1 team was behind. The decision that followed was not documented in any official account as a formal abort consideration. But the logic of what was happening was plain. If the teams on the second building breached before the team on the first building was in position, the sound would reach Abu Yusuf's floor before his door was open. A man with weapons and a reason to be afraid has a great deal he can do in 15 seconds. The teams on the second building held at the doors. They were standing in a residential corridor in a functioning apartment building in Beirut, not in a rehearsal building in northern Tel Aviv. In the actual hallway, outside the actual apartment of a PLO executive committee member, with explosive fuses ready, waiting for a signal from across the street. Every second they stood there was a second in which a door could open that was not the target door. A neighbor returning from the bathroom. A child. Someone who had heard something that was not quite identifiable and opened their door to look. The cover that worked on a street at midnight. Tourists. A woman's clothing. Rented cars had no function in a residential corridor at close range. The signal came from across the street. All 3 teams breached simultaneously. The fuses at the apartment doors detonated and the doors came open and the teams went through. What they found inside was not the scene the planning had described. Abu Yusef's apartment was not a hardened operational space with a single occupant in a defensible position. It was an apartment. His wife was there. The clearance that followed was not the clean geometry of a rehearsed drill. It was a room with people in it, some of them armed, some of them not, and a team that had to make those distinctions in the seconds after a door blew open. Abu Yusef was killed. His wife was killed in the shooting that followed. That outcome had not been part of the planning language, not because the planners were unaware that his wife existed. She did, and she was there. But because the operations framing had consistently modeled the targets as occupants of a security architecture rather than men living domestic lives inside apartments that also contained their families. The planning had structured around the guards. What was behind the doors had been filtered into a category the planning didn't have a label for. Kamal Nasser was at his desk when his door came open. He had been writing. The library his visitors had described with something like admiration, shelves covering most of a wall, manuscripts in Arabic, volumes in French and English, was exactly as reported. He was working at midnight in a city he believed would protect him. He had been wrong about that for months without knowing it. Kamal Adwan was armed and attempted to resist. The team on his floor encountered the most direct version of what the planning had anticipated, an armed man who understood what was happening and responded to it. The exchange was brief. Adwan was killed. All 3 targets were down. Documents were seized from the apartments, operational materials, correspondence, intelligence value that the planners had flagged as a secondary objective, but that would, in the days that followed, prove more significant than the immediate kills. From the exterior, Barak's backup element was now fully engaged. The breach sounds had traveled. Lebanese internal security gendarmes were responding faster than the time estimates had modeled. PLO personnel from the surrounding area were also moving toward the buildings. The exterior team held the perimeter, engaged the responding forces, and bought the time the assault teams needed to extract from the apartments and reach the ground floor. 2 Lebanese policemen were killed in the firefight outside. The teams came down and remounted into the waiting cars. The Mossad drivers pulled away from Verdun Street and moved toward the extraction corridor. For approximately 4 minutes, the operation felt finished. The shooting was behind them. The targets were confirmed, dead. The cars were moving smoothly through streets that had not yet filled with police response. The drivers knew the route. The beach was less than 10 minutes away. The Zodiacs were waiting. This is the moment operations get dangerous in a different way, the loosening of a tension that follows apparent resolution before the actual end has been reached. The convoy rounded a bend in the coast road, and the lead drivers saw it. A Lebanese Army armored personnel carrier, stationary, positioned at the edge of the road, its crew scanning the shoreline with the vehicle's lights cutting across the beach access point. The app was not a checkpoint. It was not blocking the road, but it was exactly positioned to observe the beach and exactly positioned to stop any vehicle that moved toward the water at this hour, with this level of intent. The cars slowed. The ACK crew had line of sight to the vehicles. If they stopped the lead car, if they asked for identification, if they looked in the back seat at the men carrying weapons and in one case still wearing a wig, the extraction collapsed. There was no version of that encounter that ended with the cars reaching the beach. The force was armed, which meant any confrontation would become a firefight on Lebanese soil against the Lebanese army at the edge of the city they had just operated inside. The lead car did not stop. It did not accelerate either. It maintained exactly the speed of a vehicle whose occupants had a reason to be on that road at that hour that had nothing to do with what they had just done. The ACK crew watched the cars pass. They did not move to intercept. Whether they saw something that didn't register as wrong, or saw nothing at all, or made a different calculation, there is no account of what the crew observed or decided in those seconds. The record contains only what happened. The cars passed the ACK and continued toward the beach. The teams reached the shore. They abandoned the cars where they sat. The Zodiacs were there. They rode out past the surf line, restarted the motors, and moved toward the waiting missile boats in international waters. The operation was over. 2 Israeli soldiers had been killed in the firefight outside the buildings. Nobody had planned for that either. The Lebanese Prime Minister Saif Salam learned what had happened on Verdun Street the same way most of Beirut did, from the reports coming in before dawn. Armed men. Rented cars. A force that had entered his capital by sea, killed 3 of the Arab world's most prominent Palestinian leaders in their apartments, fought a gun battle in the streets of a residential neighborhood, and left. He resigned within days. His resignation was not a gesture. It was an acknowledgement that the Lebanese government had no answer for what had just happened, no framework, no response, no version of events it could present to the Arab world or its own population that did not begin with the fact that Israeli commandos had moved freely through West Beirut and the Lebanese state had been unable to stop them, detect them, or even respond to them before they were gone. The Arab world was stunned in a specific way, not only because 3 senior Palestinian leaders were dead, because of where they had died. Beirut was supposed to be beyond this. The city's openness, its international character, its delicate political equilibrium, these were supposed to function as a kind of immunity. The immunity had been a miscalculation, and the miscalculation was now visible to everyone. The PLO did not dissolve. It reorganized. It filled the positions. Abu Yusuf, Adwan, and Nasser were replaced. But the reorganization happened under conditions of acute security anxiety, dispersed leadership, hardened protocols, a paranoia about Israeli penetration that complicated unified command in the months that followed. Senior officials who had operated openly in Beirut began moving on unpredictable schedules. Meetings that had been conducted in apartments were relocated to cars, to other cities, to formats harder to surveil from a window across the street. The documents seized from the Verdun apartments fed Israeli intelligence analysis for weeks. Some of what they contained changed how Israel understood PLO operational planning in Lebanon. Some of it raised questions that had not previously been known to ask. That was the tactical success. Clean, measurable, real. What was already beginning to surface underneath it was harder to name. The Israeli military had a secondary objective in Spring of Youth that its own planners acknowledged as presumptuous at the time, to force a confrontation between Lebanon and the Palestinian organizations operating on its soil. The logic was that a Lebanon sufficiently embarrassed by Israeli penetration might move against the PLO the way Jordan had during Black September in 1970, decisively, with force, expelling the Palestinian armed presence from its territory. Lebanon was not Jordan. What the April raid produced in Lebanon was not a government capable of acting against the PLO. It produced a government that had just resigned. It produced armed clashes between the Lebanese army and Palestinian organizations in May 1973, 5 weeks after Spring of Youth, that the army could not resolve and that the political system could not absorb. The fighting was not decisive. The PLO remained. The Lebanese army's failure to dislodge Palestinian armed presence exposed something about the Lebanese state that everyone involved had perhaps suspected, but that the May fighting confirmed. Lebanon could not enforce its own authority over the Palestinian organizations without triggering a domestic crisis that threatened the country's political structure. The head of Israeli military intelligence at the time admitted this goal was presumptuous. The admission is worth sitting with. One of the stated objectives of the operation, not a secondary hope but a named goal that shaped the planning, was one that its own architects acknowledged they could not be certain of achieving before the operation launched. The strike was authorized anyway. The gap between what was intended and what was achievable had been accepted as a condition of going forward, not resolved. The civil war that began in Lebanon in 1975 had roots that extended well before 1973. The country's sectarian political architecture, the presence of armed Palestinian factions, the chronic pressure on the Lebanese army's authority over territory it nominally controlled. None of these were created by Spring of Youth. But the operation accelerated the deterioration of a political equilibrium that was already under stress. It sharpened tensions that might otherwise have taken longer to reach their breaking point. And it confirmed, in a way that could not be walked back, that Beirut was no longer a city where the PLO leadership could assume it was beyond reach, which changed both how the PLO operated and how Lebanon managed its relationship to it, in ways that fed directly into the confrontations of May 1973 and the larger fractures that followed. In 1982, 9 years after Spring of Youth, Israel invaded Lebanon with the explicit aim of destroying the PLO infrastructure that the 1973 operation had aimed to degrade. The PLO was eventually expelled to Tunisia. Lebanon's civil war continued for another 8 years after that. The 3 men on Verdun Street had been replaced. The PLO had adapted. And the ground on which the 1973 operation had been built, the assumption that surgical strikes inside Beirut would produce strategic leverage over Lebanon's relationship with Palestinian armed organizations, had not held. Nielsen returned to Israel several days after the operation. She had stayed in Beirut long enough to avoid suspicion, long enough to walk past her apartment building on Verdun Street, past the scorch marks at the doorframes, past whatever remained of the ordinary residential block she had watched for months from her window across the street. The book written about her describes her returning to Israel and being welcomed as a national hero. Ehud Barak, when he was prime minister decades later, described her publicly as a walking legend of courage, composure, and professionalism. She married her Hebrew teacher. She served in Mossad for 15 more years. She retired. The Mossad did not allow her real name to be published when she eventually told parts of her story, 40 years after the operation. Photographs of her from after 1973 remained classified. The woman who spent months living across the street from 3 men she was there to help kill, who gave the confirmation that set the operation in motion without knowing the force had already launched, who ate dinner at the Phoenicia Hotel while Israeli commandos were rowing toward the shore. She has no public face. She is still Yael. She is still Nielsen. What it cost her to live 200 meters from those men for months, to maintain a cover identity in a city where the wrong question to the wrong person ends everything. To send intelligence she knew was not going to end in anyone's arrest or deportation, that is not in any record available to anyone outside of a classified file. The operational record describes her as cool-headed. Composed, professional, these are the words an institution uses for someone who performed at the level the institution required. They do not describe what the performance required of her. The operation that became a symbol of Israeli intelligence audacity was built on a foundation that the symbol does not include. Spring of Youth did not exist in isolation. It was the operational expression of a targeting infrastructure, a method of building intelligence around individuals over months, of embedding agents in the cities where targets lived, of accumulating the kind of granular, real-time access that no satellite or signals intercept can provide. The cases that built that method, the earlier operations where the doctrine was tested and revised and sometimes failed, are not in any public file. Some of them are in the ebook in the description below, the operational record we put together covering the deep cover collection methods and targeting cases that made operations like this one possible in the first place. It covers the methods, the cases, and the outcomes, and the same operational detail this channel works in. The link is in the description. If this operation raised questions you haven't finished thinking about, leave them in the comments. The ones that stay with people longest are usually not about whether the operation worked. They are about what working cost. We will see you in the next one.